Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball. Welcome to episode 23 of Almost Cooperstown. We're fresh off of probably the most exciting game of the World Series so far, Game 4. The series is now tied 2-2 after quite the amount of heroics, and I guess from the Rays last night, and a big mistake from the Dodgers in the bottom of the ninth inning. That was...
Yeah. Chris Taylor's got to be, punching himself right now because he just picked his head up and didn't keep his head down on the ball.
And he didn't need to because it was. I don't think Rosarena would have scored had he not done that. But I at the same time, I think if you're the Dodgers, if that's the game that they have to beat you with, where this is the game probably that matches up best for the Rays in the sense of their opener strategy works best at this point in the Dodgers rotation. You're able to exploit that mismatch the most. And it took an incredible amount of heroics from the Rays, including another Kevin Kiermaier home run, which I'm sorry, if you followed his career, the fact that he's hit like 3 of them in the World Series is unbelievable.
How about Brandon Lau hitting an opposite field home run? That was a crazy shot.
So it took the most insane amount of heroics from the Rays just to win that game. I still would take the Dodgers in the last 3.
I feel like the Dodgers are the team this year, although the Rays had the 30-1 record leading after 7 innings, and they had the lead. They lost the lead.
And then they got it back.
That's pretty impressive.
And it's just interesting when you look at these kinds of series when you're talking about them, in history and how, that play last night will be a baseball moment. A Rosarena pounding home plate is going to be a thing we see for baseball for the rest of time. Like so many other major plays.
I did feel like Jansen was going to give it up last night for some reason.
Blown the most saves in World Series history.
It just felt like he had pitched the day before. He had pitched the game, and he was sort of like dodging it. Anyway, great game, and we look forward to the next 3.
Yeah, and it's just interesting because you have those iconic moments, and you think about like other iconic moments you've seen in baseball, and one of the more celebrated moments is whenever a player gets his 3,000th hit. And, certainly you have some people where it's pretty special. Like, I think it was both Boggs and Jeter hit a home run for their 3,000th hit. That's pretty cool. But for a lot of other guys, it's not anything remarkable in the moment, but it is still a crowning career achievement to get 3,000 hits.
Well, we're going to advance that. Actually, it isn't 3,000 hits, which is a ticket to Cooperstown, and certainly it has been and still is, aside from the guys who are associated with performance-enhancing drugs who are not in the Hall of Fame.
In the general consensus, a lot of those guys is that the only reason they're not in the Hall of Fame is because of the performance-enhancing drugs. If you just looked at their career and without taking that into account, every single one of those guys is a Hall of Famer.
Yeah. We've said that before about guys like Barry Bonds, who was a Hall of Famer before he started doing anything. If in
Though
fact,
he did not get 3,000 hits.
He did not.
Just short.
So there are, players we're going to talk about are players you've heard of almost, every single one. 90% of them you're going to know, except for some of the guys who played before 1900 or in the early 1900s.
Dead ball era guys where it's just like a different game almost.
So we'll run through the names just because and what you'll find is that the common ground here between all these guys is they play a lot of seasons.
And that's, I think, one of the aspects of getting 3,000 hits is that while it requires excellence and the ability, you have to truly be a good hitter to get 3,000 hits. Just playing a hell of a lot of years is super important, too.
Yeah, yes, compiling has something to do with it.
Because you look at, like, the top 5 guys. So you've got Pete Rose, who played 24 seasons, had 4,200 hits. Ty Cobb played 24 seasons, had 4,100 hits.
Right.
Hank Aaron played 23 seasons, had 3,700 hits. Stan Musial played 22 seasons, had 3,600 hits. And Tris Speaker played 22 seasons, had 3,500 hits. So you can see right there, every single one of those guys played 22 seasons plus.
Yeah.
That's going to help.
And actually, a guy who's further down the list who doesn't have 3,000 hits, but if you added his hits in Japan, would have more hits than Pete Rose, because if you remember, Ichiro came here, he'd already played a lot of years in Japan and accumulated 1,278 hits in Japan. Mm-hmm. So certainly would have. Actually, he's got over 3,000 hits. I meant to say he would have more hits than Rose.
Yeah, he would surpass Rose for the all-time.
We don't count the Japanese league. That's fine.
We don't count him, even though you have to think, oh my God, if he had played his whole career in America, what would his career stats look like?
So the next 5 guys actually led by a guy who's not in the Hall of Fame, but he certainly will be, in Derek Jeter. And I was surprised.
More of a when, not if.
Yes, no doubt. 3,465 hits for Jeter, and that surprised me because I remember when he got his 3,000 hit, as you say about the home run, and actually was at the game where he got his 3,000th hit. And then he still got another 465 hits after that.
It's surprising to me that he played that much longer after that he was able to get that many hits, because that would mean it
was iffy, like he was going to get 3,000 at one point.
And then he has played probably another 4 or 5 seasons.
Just another reason why he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. So we've got Cap Anson, who played the bulk of his career in the early 1900s, a Hall of Fame player.
It's just so much harder to evaluate those guys.
He had 512 sacrifice hits, which is the greatest of all time. But who cares?
Those don't count.
They're not hits.
It was just that's what they called sacrifices.
They called them sacrifice hits. Yeah, for the longest time when I was growing up scoring games, you put sacrifice hit, but it wasn't a hit. It was a sacrifice.
Yeah, just call it a sacrifice or a bunt or a sac fly. It's not a hit.
The great Honus Wagner, 21 seasons and 3,400 hits. Carl Yastrzemski is high up there at number 9 at 3,419, and Paul Molitor at 3,319 hits. There's a reason why he's in the Hall of Fame, and I think sometimes people forget Paul Molitor.
And it's interesting because then you get in kind of like the next group of guys, and I know the rest of 3 of the 4 of the 5 really well, because you've got Willie Mays, Eddie Murray, Nap LaJoie, and Albert Pujols. All of them have 3,000 hits. Pujols is at the bottom of that group with the lowest at 3,200. But the guy that's kind of at the top of them is a guy named Eddie Collins. He played for 25 seasons and got 3,300 hits. No idea who this is.
So Eddie Collins was played in the early 1900s. He came up with the Athletics in the late 1909 or 1908, and he was on the World Championship teams for the A's. They won in 10, 11, and 13.
So was he on the same teams as Cap Anson then?
No, he didn't play for the same team.
Okay.
And so then he got traded away after a bunch of years, and then he came back to the A's in 1928 and won the World Series in 29 and 30 at the end of his career. Now he's like a 39-year-old guy.
So he's like this. So he's like what they used to. We were talking about kind of, I think in a previous episode where sometimes in the last episode where the ownership would trade for an aging Hall of Famer as a way to boost ticket sales. So did they trade for Eddie Collins and just oops, we won the World Series.
Right, so he didn't win the last World Series that they won in 31, but he did win 4 World Series, all with the A's, and yet he did spend 12 years with the Chicago White Sox.
Yeah, that's got to be frustrating if you're the White Sox. You
exactly.
missed out on the championships that guy won.
Absolutely. He was on the team that won the World Series for the Sox in 1917, so a lot of World Series for Eddie Collins. Yeah, those guys, probably he'd be the only guy you really don't know all that well. Now you go to Cal Ripken at number 16, Adrian Beltre, who will be in the Hall of Fame.
For anybody that doesn't really know, I think Beltre is one of those guys that because he's still playing and because he's playing.
He's retired.
He was playing up until last season, correct? Yeah. And he played on the West Coast pretty much his entire career. He played for Seattle, Texas, and the Dodgers. He came up as a Dodger.
Right.
So people on the East Coast, I think if you didn't really pay attention, you don't have an appreciation for how good Adrian Beltre was.
And obviously a fantastic fielder as well.
One of the best defensive third basemen, and unbelievable. When we say he's a Hall of Famer, he's probably a first ballot.
I would put him there for sure.
He's that good.
He's got the home runs. He's got everything you want.
I think he's one of the rare kind of underappreciated. I think it's just because his career was also on not a lot of great teams playing for the Mariners and the Rangers. Right. I don't think a lot of modern baseball fans or enough modern baseball fans.
It's an East Coast bias. Come on, let's be honest. We're here in the East Coast, and we don't watch those late West Coast games and get to see him play.
He's that good. He's really that good.
So George Brett, another fabulous third baseman at 3154 is number 18. Paul Wainer, he and his brother Lloyd, who was not nearly the player that Paul was, but got a lot of credit. Paul was a terrific Hall of Fame player, 152 hits. And Robin Yount surprised me at being up at 3142 at number 20.
And it's interesting because you've got actually a pretty good split of lefties and righties. In this. So you can see that it's not the fact that there are as many lefties up here on this list, because, just looking through the top, 20-ish, it looks like there's 4 to 5 lefties, which kind of does tell you a little bit that being a left-handed batter, there is some advantage to it.
Absolutely has an advantage. And all the guys that we've talked about, and all the way through, actually, we're at 20 now, have more than 20 or more seasons played. So here we go with
we're going to get the first guy in this next grouping that's under 20 seasons.
Yeah, but that's only because he played half of his
Exactly. He played another 12 seasons in Japan. So you've got Tony Gwynn at 21 with 3,100 hits.
One of the greatest pure hitters of all time.
I think it's wild. Go look at his strikeout stats for some seasons. It's wacky how little he struck out. Then you've got a steroid guy in A-Rod, but he's still steroids didn't help A-Rod get 3,100 hits.
Agreed.
They didn't help him make contact. Might help to knock a few more out of the park. Maybe a couple of those dying quail singles would have been
respect the talent,
but that was 3,100 hits that guy got. Then you got Dave Winfield.
22 seasons. Yep, 3,100
And then
hits.
the first guy now coming in at under 20 seasons is Ichiro, who only played 19 seasons in the majors because he played like another 10 in Japan. 3,000 hits, 3,089. That's just impressive. And rounding that grouping out is actually a guy I wouldn't have expected to get there, Craig Biggio.
And that sealed Biggio.
That kind of locked him in.
Although I remember him being the distinction that Biggio had was he was an all-star at catcher, at second base, and center field. The only guy to be an all-star at 3 different positions.
And it's so interesting that it was all straight up the middle too.
Yes. Where you got to be strong to be a good baseball team. People used to say.
Yep.
And going below that, you've got Ricky Henderson. We're still over 3,000 hits. Ricky has 3,055 hits.
This is where you start getting into the grouping of guys that are right at 3,000. So you're going to see a bunch of guys coming in here that are like right at the 3,000 mark because that's what their goal was. They play that final season just to get that 3,000th hit.
I think that's true, actually, and a really good point. Rod Carew, again, a fabulous player we've talked about before, Hall of Fame player. Lou Brock, 19 seasons for Carew and for Lou Brock. Still just over 3,000 hits. At number 29 is Rafael Palmeiro, the guy with the most hits, who isn't in the Hall of Fame aside from A-Rod and not Barry Bonds, and Pujols, who is
A-Rod, Pujols, and Pete Rose.
Right. Pete Rose, yes. So that's pretty impressive. And Wade Boggs comes in at number 30. He had 3,010 hits.
Yeah, and then you're starting to get the last 2 guys to achieve 3,000 hits in their career were Al Kaline, who had 3,007 hits.
The late Al Kaline, who just passed away recently.
22 seasons, and then it's kind of sad, but it's kind of magical in a way. Roberto Clemente played 18 seasons, had exactly 3,000 hits.
And for those that remember, he died in that plane crash in 1972 trying to take relief supplies to Puerto Rico.
Part of you is like, I'm so glad he got that. Could you have imagined if he had finished
$29.99?
Yeah. I feel like I wonder if major leagues would have like posthumously giving him a hit.
But I think it's no, I don't think so. I think that today we look back on it, and it wouldn't matter as much if he didn't have 3,000 hits. But at the time he got in the Hall of Fame, it was super important.
I think it would still matter today, though, for the symbolic nature of it. The fact that he was able to still achieve that mark before tragedy struck, I think would be really important.
I think you're right.
And then I think once you get kind of past that, now you get into 2 guys I don't know well, both with the same first name, and Sam Rice and Sam Crawford, who both fell pretty much just short of 3,000
But it didn't stop him from getting the Hall of Fame.
No, both of them are in there. And then you've got Frank Robinson, who's in there as well. And those guys are all at like 2,900.
So there aren't too many guys that come from the pre-1900 or at the beginning of the 1900 era. Jake Beckley is there. Barry Bonds checks in at number 37 with 2,935 hits. And Willie Keeler at 2,932
There's that
hits.
name again.
I love that play. Hit him where they ain't. I just, love that. Chop the ball and get a base hit. And surprisingly, Rogers Hornsby, truly one of the great players of all time, didn't have 3,000 hits. And I wonder how much it bothered him or if it meant anything that he didn't get 3,000 hits.
I bet because of when he was playing, it probably didn't bother him as much, but I bet as time progressed and more guys reached that mark,
should have played another year and got maybe 73 more hits. It
probably bugged him more because when he retired, it wasn't like there was a lot of guys that had achieved that mark, so it wasn't as notable a thing. But then as the time passed and suddenly all these guys were getting all this recognition for getting 3,000 hits, the fact that you were like 70 short would really bug you.
Al Simmons checks in right behind him at just 3 hits fewer, 2,927. Again, another all-time great player, who is in the Hall of Fame and didn't get the 3,000 hits.
And then I think we mentioned both of these guys last week, actually, with Zach Wheat and Frankie Fish. Both played 19 seasons.
Frankie Fish, yeah.
Like they were just shy of 2,900 hits, like 20 or less. It's just interesting. And then you have a guy who I think is a very interesting case for a Hall of Famer, Omar Vizquel. Right. He played 24 seasons, had almost 2,900 hits. Is he a Hall of Famer?
Yeah, we've talked about him before.
We've talked about him before.
I never felt watching Omar Vizquel play that he was a Hall of Fame player, but in looking at his stats and knowing how good a defensive shortstop he really was, since we're of the mind that of the 333 people in the Hall of Fame, we could use a few more, he might be a guy I would say, why shouldn't he be in?
At the same time, you kind of, that's where you start having the realization in your, he kind of strikes you out as the first person that's like, oh yeah, you can get to 3,000 hits just kind of by like compiling.
So he had to play another season and get 123 hits, and then he would be in the Hall of Fame.
But at where he was in his career, he wasn't getting 123
probably
hits
not. He was probably 55 years old by the time.
He was probably going to take him another couple seasons to get that many.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you've got a guy like Mel Ott, who is a Hall of Famer.
Absolutely.
And then after him is a kind of a no-doubter, Babe Ruth. Yeah, he might have only had 2,800 hits, but I don't think there's anybody in America making the argument that Babe Ruth ain't a Hall of Famer.
No, a guy who did make the Hall of Fame, but it was quite controversial when he was voted in. And Harold Baines checks in at number 46 with 2,866 career hits. And I think it is the aggregation of all the hits, because Harold Baines played most of his career as a designated hitter. A lot of his career, I should say, and wasn't quite Edgar Martinez, and when it came
in terms of an overall offensive threat.
But there are a lot of people that sort of throw it on him that he's the guy that is the poster child for what's wrong with the Hall of Fame, because you put a guy in there who was not an all-time great player. 2,866 hits in 22 years. It's not like he played 24 or 25. That's an impressive number to me. And he's tied.
And that's something that we were just knocking Vizquel for, because when you look at it, he got 2,800 hits over 24 seasons. That means he's averaging like 100 hits a season. That's not
more
as
than that. Yeah.
It's not as, but not that much more than that.
No.
And that's not nearly as impressive as like Pete Rose getting 4,200 hits over the same 24 seasons.
Where more impressively, in 18 seasons, Miguel Cabrera, active player, has 2,866 hits, just like Harold Baines.
And we can just kind of clear this up right now. Miggy's a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, absolutely. First ballot, as far as I'm concerned.
Won a triple crown in the modern era, like in the more modern era. You don't do that by accident.
And rounding out the top 50, you've got an old-time player, Jesse Burkett, who has 2,850 hits. I don't know too much about Mr. Burkett.
But did it in only 16 seasons.
Yeah.
But he was playing in an era in baseball where I wonder if it was easier to amass hits because you would use the Wee Willie Keeler strategy of just hit it where they ate.
We're going to talk about that. And checking in at 49 is Brooks Robinson with 2,848, and Pudge Rodriguez, Ivan Rodriguez, with 21 seasons and 2,844 hits. So there's your top 50, and you remember most of those players. Sure.
And really outside of the steroid guys, Rose, Vizquel, and then the two active players, every one of those guys was a Hall of Famer.
So if you just take the top 50 and you go down a little bit there, it seems with Gehringer at 51 and Sisler at 52, both having over 2,800 hits. 2,800 hits is about the level, because once you start getting down below 2,800 career hits, now you have some questionable guys who, is this guy really a Hall of Famer just because he has a lot of hits?
You start needing to have other aspects to your career. Like Ken Griffey Jr. only had 2,700 hits. But he was an unbelievable power hitter and an unbelievable defensive fielder.
Yeah, and a guy who could run, too.
Yeah, a guy like Chipper Jones only had 2,700 hits. But a solid defensive third baseman, not amazing, but I remember he was solid. And then
absolutely, as much as I can't stand the fact that he killed us all the time,
from like both sides of the plate, and was an unbelievable player.
He probably hit 500 against the Mets.
Yeah,
and so the guy who's sort of glowing in this, 10 between 50 and 60 is at number 55. Played 18 seasons, amassed 2,769 hits. It's Johnny Damon.
And that's where you can start getting into the discussion of compiling.
And I don't want to throw shade on Johnny Damon.
No, it's not about Johnny Damon not being a good player, but that's where you start seeing that, okay, given enough time, types of players can reach these numbers. And it's not that Johnny Damon isn't a good baseball player. I don't think Johnny Damon is a Hall of Famer.
That's how I feel about it. And yet he does have some pretty impressive postseason home runs and exploits that count, I think, for it.
They count.
If I said Damon has a 56.3 career WAR, that's borderline, right? He doesn't make our 18 years 56, and they all count. So he's right there at the 3 or so per season he needs to be considered. 235 homers, 284 career average, on base at 352, 408 stolen bases. 0 Gold Gloves. Obviously, I don't think anybody would have rated Johnny Damon. That's what undercuts you.
That's
right
what
there,
undercuts him, is that he was not a great defensive player.
I think, but
good might have been stretching it.
Yeah, and so a great major league player, and as are some of the other guys that are we're going to talk about going forward a little bit. They just didn't get the 2,800 hits, and it seems like there's a reason that they're not in the Hall of Fame.
And then you have a couple guys that are right below that are a little bit kind of equal. You'd say Carlos Beltran, who actually had less career hits than Damon, probably actually has a better chance of making it in.
I feel that, and I don't know that Beltran will be a first ballot Hall of Famer, but I think he is going to be a Hall of Famer.
The only thing that could hurt him is his connection to the whole Astros thing.
Yeah.
I could see him, unfortunately, kind of being retroactively punished.
Baseball does have a way of doing that.
Certainly it would keep him from being a first ballot.
So a couple of other interesting names on this list. Al Oliver is in there. I always talk about him as I just liked him so much as a player. Dave Parker, another Pirate like Al Oliver, 2,700 career hits, great defensive player, a lot of home runs, perennial all-star. But because he doesn't have 2,800 hits or more, we're going to argue he's not in the Hall of Fame, and he's not going to probably get voted into the Hall of Fame by the Veterans Committee.
Even right behind him is a guy like Gary Sheffield, who I think we've talked about before as kind of being a border. I think he's kind of a poster child for a Hall of Very Good. Like, he would be one of the lead guys in the Hall of Very Good.
The 509 career home runs that gets my attention.
Yeah, and that's something that he has that sets him apart from a guy like Bill Buckner, who actually had a few more hits than Sheffield over the same number of seasons. But Sheffield had 509 career home runs.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to, and here's the thing that you'll find interesting, and for different reasons, guys like Ted Williams are down at number 77. Well, Ted Williams lost 3+ years of his career being in the war at the prime of his career.
Exactly. And so I think it's like one of the things, and you even have guys like Robinson Cano is in there right behind Ted Williams at 2,600 hits. And
Robbie Cano is going to the Hall of Fame, and I guess people will ding him a little bit for the performance enhancing that he got suspended for, but he paid his penance, if you will, and didn't play those 80 games. That could impact his opportunity.
And honestly, you would have a hard time making the argument that he would certainly be in the top 2 greatest offensive second basemen of all time.
I agree with that. And even further down the list, you have guys like DiMaggio only played 13 seasons, so his career hit total is not going to be 3,000, but there's nobody who'd question Joe DiMaggio.
And that's where I think you have to kind of start discussing how much is getting 3,000 hits a function of you also having longevity and the ability to compile statistics. Because the other thing that you notice when you go through these names that have 3,000 hits, 2 things jump out to you. It's guys that played a lot of seasons, and it's a lot of guys that played a lot of seasons a while ago.
Well, and I think that's right, because you talk about old baseball and 1900 and before, and if you get to those 3,000 hits, the kind of pitching you were facing late in the games is a lot different. I think we're going to advance that trying to get 3,000 hits today has never been more difficult, because you're not facing these ridiculous bullpens like the Rays have trying to get hits late in the game.
And think
last night's game notwithstanding, by the way.
You're a baseball player in 1925, right? So you're going to pitch.
You're out of the dead ball era.
You're out of the dead ball era, so you're playing functionally the same game that we're playing today. Maybe the bat wood's gotten a little better, the ball's a little more advanced.
And style has changed. Guys are trying to jerk the ball instead of slap the ball.
Right, but that would actually probably lead you to getting more hits than less hits. But I think so that's certainly a factor. It's just the batting approach. But I think the biggest thing is you're playing what? Teams still played series against each other, right? So you would play, a team 3 or 4 times in a couple-day period. It wouldn't be like you'd play one game against them and then 3 weeks later you'd play another game against the same team. No, you're playing them 3 or 4 days in a row. How many pitchers did those teams back in 1920 carry?
No, the pitchers that they carried was not very many pitchers. No. They didn't have a staff of 10 guys.
No, you maybe had the 4 or 5 guys that...
And you were expected to go out and pitch the whole game.
So think about that. It's late September in the 1925 season. You're in the 3rd game series against the Philadelphia Athletics, right? And they throw out Joe. He's their, pitcher for the 3rd game in the series. Joe's probably thrown 11 billion innings this season so far because he throws the whole game every time. You think facing Joe in the bottom of the 7th after he's thrown 140 pitches in that game is going to be the same effectiveness of a pitcher as when they bring out, Baez from the bullpen last night? Different animal altogether.
And they did weird things back at the turn of the 20th century. So one year, everybody hated Ty Cobb, and he was in a batting race with Napa Lajoie. And so the players hated Cobb so much that they basically backed off in the last game of the season and let Lajoie bunt 6 times successfully up the third baseline to get base hits so he would beat Cobb and for the batting title. But he didn't. He actually came like a hundredth of a point short, and Cobb ended up winning anyway.
Cobb must have, that would be, the only thing that makes me sad is that if that happened today, could you imagine the social media pop off from Ty Cobb?
I love
if I'm Ty Cobb, I am on Instagram, I am on Facebook, I am on YouTube, I am on Twitter being like, suck it, all of you. You tried to beat me and you still couldn't.
One of the great hitters of all time.
And he probably would have said something like that too, because he didn't give any kind of care about how people perceived him.
So I think we're going to see fewer and fewer players get to that 3,000, and that level will get down. Maybe it'll be 2,800. Maybe it'll go lower than that because it's not going to become as important at the amount of hits you get. It's your overall performance as a player that's become much more important now.
Right, but I'm actually going to posit something a little paradoxical here. In that, I think you're going to see a player beat Pete Rose's record out of the modern era. I think that's actually pretty likely. The reason being is there's going to be...
Does he play in California?
I don't know if it would be Mike Trout. I don't know if it would be Trout, but my thinking behind this is there's going to be some guy that comes up that's going to approach the game that way, but the difference for him is while he's facing a higher quality of pitcher, the care that he takes of his body that's going to allow him to play more seasons is going to be something that the guys in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s never dreamed of.
Well, and even go back earlier than that, they kept playing because there was nobody better.
Yeah, you're not going to have that. You're not going to have some 45-year-old guy that gets ekes out 100 hits over a season because there wasn't another guy that could do that on them.
But, in order to compile, it's a pretty simple math problem. 3,000 hits in a career, you got to play 20 years and average 150 hits a year. Well, there may be some years that you get more than that. Guys usually get over 200, but you could be injured some years and not get any hits.
So, it's when you have a guy, and that's how a guy like Ichiro was able to do it, because, there was probably definitely some seasons near the end where he wasn't even getting, 100 at-bats in a season. But he had those seasons before that, 262, 272 that one season. That's going to help in those seasons then when you don't play quite as much.
Right, but I don't see too many guys that have 250 hit capabilities in the major leagues.
What it's going to take is there's going to have to be a paradigm shift. Baseball is shifted in a way right now where what's valued is launch angle and exit velocity. So it's going to lead to guys getting less hits because you have more guys trying to launch the ball and hit home runs. But some guy's going to come around and be like, I'm not going to do things that way. And he's just going to slap the ball all over the place. And baseball will shift. It always goes through shifts like this.
So 3,000 hits is definitely the barometer to say, if you got 3,000 hits, you should be in the Hall of Fame. Forget about the guys who have more than that who aren't.
You might be a little bit of compiling, but you didn't compile those by accident.
And that could probably be pushed down to 2,800 when you think about, the guys that are in the Hall of Fame.
2,800 is generally the cutoff point where, if you needed it to be your last push over the hump, it'll get you there. But if you're below 2,800, there really has to be some other part of your career that you can paint with excellence. And even then, you could be Gary Sheffield, hit 500 home runs, and it still isn't enough.
It doesn't sound as sexy to have. Oh yeah, he had 2,800 hits. It doesn't. You remember 3,000 hits.
There's Mr. 3,000,
500 home runs.
There's a reason why Mr. Bernie Mac starred in the movie Mr. 3000. It wasn't Mr. 2,800.
Exactly. So that's our show.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at AlmostCoop.